but they're not explicitly stated as being queer. And that can have positive and negative effects, right? Positive because then in areas where you cannot have representation, you're able to assume representation. A good example of this would be Elsa. So Disney, for a long, long time, has been very against the idea of putting LGBT representation in their media. Now, recently that has changed, but when Frozen 1 came out, that was still an issue. And Elsa had this great song, Let It Go, and a lot of people saw it as a coding for a person who has to hide their identity for their own safety, their gender or sexual orientation, right? And so she was coded as being perhaps gay, perhaps transgender, perhaps something like that. Now that was a positive representation because Disney just was being very stubborn about putting representation into their films, so people could look to Elsa. But it's also can have a really negative effect. We see that a lot of Disney villains are coded as being queer in some way. Right? Jafar, he's drawn in kind of what we think of in Western society as a more feminine way, right? He's more thin, he's got thin shoulders, the way he talks is coded in such a way that's a little more feminine, right? What about Ursula? How do you think she might be coded as being queer in any way? How many of us have seen these movies, by the way? So I apologize if you haven't seen the movies, but how might she be coded? Yes?
They said that they referenced drag queens when they were creating her.
She's modeled after Divine.
Yeah.
Ursula.
Oh.
She's modeled after Divine, who was a drag queen in like the 70s, 80s, question mark. Who was like really politically charged and like very against everything Disney did, basically. And so she's painted as a villain.
Now, as an individual character, right, Ursula's really interesting, and I love her, and I love her songs, and some of the villains have the best songs in all of Disney films. But how is it negative? How is it negative when we constantly have villains coded as queer?
It just paints the image as queer with negativity and evil.
Absolutely. Queer equals evil, right? When all of your, or most, or a lot of your characters who are villains are coded this way. We see it in so many Disney films. There are other examples of queer coding and queer baiting, which is slightly different than queer coding. So queer coding means that a character has been coded, and you see some either stereotypes or representations of LGBT culture in a character. Queer baiting is when it is done as a way to get viewers who are part of that community, who might be excited at the prospect of having actual representation, and then there's a bait and switch, and they say, oh no, this character actually fell in love with, or this woman fell in love with man, right? Even though it seemed, like for instance, if Elsa, which the story is not yet complete on Frozen, so we'll see what happens, but Elsa, who has been very queer-coded, if Elsa ends up falling in love with a man in the next film, that would be queer baiting, because she has become this icon. This is an example that, has anyone seen Avatar or The Legend of Korra? Yes. This is The Legend of Korra. So this is not an example of queer baiting, it's queer coding, and for a long time, like the film, or not the film, the series has 4 seasons, right? And in 4 seasons, nothing is said really about Korra's sexuality. So for people watching it, they were hoping and hoping. There were indications there was queer coding involved with her and this relationship with this woman named Asami, but it was never explicit until the very, very, very last scene where they hold hands as they leave. And that is an interesting example because it kind of showcases how queer coding helps to hide for the purposes of safety, right? But then also it can give people a representation when representation was not allowed. And then what Nickelodeon did is okay, well this series is over now, so now we can put this in the very last moment so that we give that representation to people so that they can look back and say, yes, this obviously was not just queer coding, but a queer character. And so it wasn't a bait, and everyone was very happy about that. Or people who wanted that, I would say everyone was very happy about that. But Rainbow Dash, right? Rainbow Dash, if anyone's seen My Little Pony, is coded as a queer character. She has a deeper voice. She is much more, has what in Western society we deem as more masculine traits. Dumbledore, right? Dumbledore is a little bit of an interesting one because throughout the books, if you've ever read Harry Potter, I don't know, see, my generation is like all about Harry Potter. I don't know if it's as popular nowadays, but Dumbledore throughout the books, there's no real indication that he feels a certain way, and there's not really much talk about his sexuality at all. But then later, J.K. Rowling comes out and says, yes, he was gay, or is, you know, stories will
She
not
was like,
forever.
obviously. You
Right.
guys didn't pick up on that?
Right, and so that is a little bit of a strange example because it's a little bit of queer baiting in that there's no actual representation in the story of anything happening, right? If you chose to, you could interpret the story as, no, Dumbledore's not gay, because nothing happens in there to indicate it, right? Yes?
And that's also amplified by the fact that J.K. Rowling decided immediately to just go full transphobe,
Of
like
course.
aggressively for years.
Yeah, so we have these examples of queer coding and queer baiting. Now, my question to you is, can music be queer coded? And when I mean music, there's different types of music, right? There's music with lyrics, which makes things more obvious, and then there's music without lyrics. So what do you think of this? Can music without lyrics be queer coded?
Sorry, repeat the question.
Can music, specifically music without lyrics, be queer coded? We're going to delve a little bit into classical music today. I know that we haven't done any of that, and it's not exactly a classical music course, but I think it's an interesting topic that I want to discuss a little bit. Any thoughts before I kind of lay down my facts about this individual? Can music be queer coded? Yes.
In relation to the super villains, the queer villain, this is another example.
Yeah.
I've seen the Powerpuff Girls. No,
Yeah. Oh, him.
him
Yes.
from Powerpuff Girls.
Him from the Powerpuff Girls. Yes, definitely.
Would that be, I guess, coding? I mean, it's kind of his appearance is obviously kind of
Yeah.
or there.
Definitely queer coding. He's got a really high voice. He is wearing more feminine clothes, at least what we see in Western society as feminine. Yes.
So back to the question at hand.
Yes.
Maybe program music could have that. Because
Okay.
it's like more really absolute music. I'm not sure. It's
Okay.
like it's music for the sake of music.
So what Kane is talking about is there's a difference between music that has an intentional story behind it and music that is just for the sake of music. So if you think of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, it doesn't have a name other than its form, right? It's a symphony. It's the Fifth Symphony. It doesn't have a name like the Pastoral Symphony that would make you think of of land and sheep. It doesn't have a specific story behind it that's written in a program or anything like that. So Kane is saying program music perhaps has more of a likelihood to be queer coded than absolute music or music for the sake of music. Any other thoughts? Can music without words be queer coded? Yes?
Nothing else besides that. Just 2 thumbs up.
2 thumbs up. 2 thumbs up. So, I wish I could play the piano better. But if you hear this, if you hear dun da 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 da, would you think masculine or feminine? masculine. So generally, most of us would think masculine, right? We've kind of been trained in Western society to think of masculine as a certain way. That might be viewed as masculine. What about?
It's okay, just leave it.
What about that? Would you see it as more masculine or more feminine? It's okay if you see it as masculine. It's totally fine. There's no right or wrong answer.
There's just a trend.
Okay, maybe feminine, maybe, right? So that actually, if you look at classical music, we have examples of people using certain things to actually represent certain genders. So for instance, in Berlioz's Symphonie Fantastique, which we talked about today, the theme, is representative of the perfect woman. So it is intended to be feminine, right? So we do see femininity and masculinity in music, and in fact, previously, it's no longer this way, but previously, certain things about music, the way we describe music, music theory, were actually attributed masculine or feminine attributes. For instance, you would have feminine endings, which would be cadences or endings of phrases that were not very strong. They were the weak cadences. And then masculine endings were the strong cadences. Or you would have a sonata form, which has one theme, and then a second theme in a different key, and then you jumble them around, and then and both of them are in the tonic or the first key. Right? So the first one is the masculine theme, and the second one in a different key is the feminine theme. That's not how we talk about it anymore, but back in the day, in the 1800s, that is how they referred to them. So, Susan McClary, she wrote this landmark book in the early 1990s called Feminine Endings. And the whole book totally threw all of musicology on its head. She really delved into music and looked at how it evoked ideas of gender and sexuality. Music, absolute music. Music that wasn't necessarily programmatic or wasn't necessarily... she also did look at opera and things like that. But this is a quote from her book, specifically a chapter about Tchaikovsky. She says, "Literature and visual art are almost always concerned, at least in part, with the organization of sexuality, the construction of gender, the arousal and channeling of desire. So is music, except that music may perform these functions even more effectively than other media. Since few listeners know how to explain how it creates its effects, music gives the illusion of operating independently of cultural mediation. It is often received, and not only by the musically untutored, as a mysterious medium within which we seem to encounter our own most private feelings. The music is able to contribute heavily, if surreptitiously, to the shaping of individual identities. Along with other influential media such as film, music teaches us how to experience our own emotions, our own desires, and even, especially in dance, our own sides. That's supposed to be this. For better or for worse, it socializes us." So her argument is that we look at popular music, and in fact, as she writes later on in this very chapter, she says, in popular music, there's obviously sexuality involved. If you look at the Rolling Stones, the Beatles, the Ronettes, and further, we see sexuality in music. So why has there been no study done about sexuality in classical music? And that is what she does. And it kind of changed the way that musicologists did research and looked at music. Now, her findings have been disputed, and it's not necessarily, she is a little bit essentialist, meaning that she says, this equals this, which is not